Now we're going to take some time in this lesson and look at the files that make up the databases on a SQL server. It's important to understand because it's necessary when you're creating the databases, if you need to move them around, back them up, add files to make databases bigger. Lots and lots of reasons why you need to understand this, so we're going to go through and sort of explain it. So here we are again on our 2012 SQL instance, and let's just look at the AdventureWorks database. So from the SQL standpoint, this is a database which contains tables and stored procedures and views and data, but underneath it's actually physical files in the operating system. Okay, so the database is made up of a couple different types of files, and if you right click a database, select properties, and then select the files page, you can see the files that are part of this database. So you can see that there are two in this particular database. There's a data file, and the data files always have types of row data, because that file contains data. And there's a log file. That is the transaction log, which we will talk about in great detail in Lesson 10, about what the transaction log is and how it works. For now, just understand that it's one of the files as part of the database. These are physical files, okay, like I said, and they're located, in my case, on D, SQL Data 2012 R2. So if I go D, SQL Data, and then I go into my 2012 R2 folder, you'll see here's my files. I also happen to have a backup file in here. Ignore that. That's just a backup file. These are the data files, the MDF and the LDF. So data files have an extension of MDF, or you might see some that have an extension called NDF, as in N as in Nancy, DF. And then of course the LDF stands for log data file. Okay, so these are the physical files on disk. Now, what's the difference and why are they here? The data file is going to contain pretty much all the data in your database. Your tables, your data, your procs, everything that you save in the database goes into the data file. Okay, so all this stuff you see over here underneath the database, all that is stored in the data file. The log file, and again we'll get into that in much more detail in Lesson 10, is basically a scratch pad where SQL will record new transactions before it has a chance to write them to the data files. Okay, now I'm going to click Add because I want to show you a couple other options. So when I click Add, it basically gives me a new line where I could create a new file and I can give it a name. So for example, if I wanted to add another data file, I can do data2. What file group? Right now, I only have the primary file group in this database. We'll talk about file groups towards the end of this lesson. How big you want the file to be, what auto growth settings, and I'll come back and talk about those in a second. The path to the file. So it defaults to your default data directory, which is a setting in SQL, but you can change this to whatever you want. You can just type in here, or you can click the little ellipses to go browse to another path. And then the actual file name. So you can see here's the file name as it corresponded to what we saw when we looked at the file folder. And again, you can type whatever you want the name to be. Now, here's your options for the type of file. It's either rows data or log. Okay, we already kind of mentioned that. The reason you have these two options is because you have to tell it what kind of file this is. Are you adding another file to your database's transaction log? Or are you adding another file to your data, to hold data? Okay. Any file that you add that's another row data beyond this first one, you don't have to. It certainly isn't required. Like I could call the file adventureworks.dat if I really wanted. The convention though is N as in Nancy DF. NDF. So I would make a second file. Now, reasons to add new files. This data file might be 10 gigs on a drive that only has a gig of free space left, and you need to add another 10 gigs to your database. So you'd have to make another file on a separate hard drive in order to put that file up with 10 gigs, because there's just not enough space on the primary hard drive. That's one reason you'd split and add another file. The other thing you can do is you can actually go through the use of file groups, and you can put different tables, different indexes, different pieces of your database on different files to sort of spread the load over multiple hard drives. So that's another big reason why you'd make an additional file. As for the log file, you'll see there's no file group. Okay, I can't change this. And if I change this to a log, you still can't change it. Like the drop-down comes up, but you can't change it. Okay, that's because the log file doesn't have a concept of file group. Okay, you have one transaction log in your database. It could just be made up of multiple files. Again, there are performance reasons why you might have multiple files. Give yourself, again, spread it across multiple drives, being able to grow when the drive's full, whatever. So there's reasons why you'd have more than one. Okay. As far as some of those performance considerations in tuning go, kind of outside the scope of this lesson, this is just kind of understand the files. Now, let's talk about some of these other options. Initial size, pretty straightforward. How big in megabytes do you want the file to be? And it will create the file that large. So if you say 3 gig, it'll instantly create a 3 gig file. Okay? Auto grow. You can set all these files to automatically grow. And by default, unless you've changed something in your model database, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the system databases, by default it will be set to auto grow. So what that means, let's just look at the primary data file here. I'm going to click the little ellipses so you can see the options. You can enable or disable auto grow. You can tell it how you want to grow, and you can set a max. So if it's enabled, what that means is once this file is getting to where it's full, and I'll slide this down so you can see, it's a 170 meg file right now. So once it's almost full with 170 meg worth of data, the data file will automatically grow. And it'll grow based on this setting. So if I want to grow in megabytes, I could go over here and say in megabytes 50. And what will happen is as it approaches that 170 mark and the file is about to get full, it'll grow the file by an additional 50 megabytes. So it'll go from 170 to 220. Then as it fills up again, it'll go from 220 to 270 and so on. I can also choose to grow in percentages. So again, if I left this at 10% as this filled, 170 is 10% of that, 17, so it would become 187. The next time it got close to filling, it would grow by 10%, which is like 18.7 meg. So it would jump up another 18.7 meg to just over 200, so on and so forth, each time it grew. Okay, so that's your two options for how to grow it, fixed size or based on the percentage of the database. Now, max file. Again, two options here. Unlimited, which means that this file will grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and never stop until it fills up the hard drive it's on. Okay? And that's not necessarily a scary thing. Like, don't think unlimited growth is bad. It just depends on your database. If you have a database that could potentially grow completely and totally out of control, then you might want to put a limit on. In general, though, if you understand the growth of your databases and you've got plenty of free space on your hard drive, you can leave this unlimited. Just keep an eye on it and monitor your hard drive space like any good sysadmin would do. You can also limit it. So if you want to let this auto grow, but you want to limit it to, say, 2 gig or something, you can type in whatever you want. So about 2 gig, about 2,000 meg, would limit it to that level, 2,000 meg. Why would you do that? I might have 5 or 6 files on a hard drive, and I want them all to be able to grow, and I don't want one database overrunning the hard drive and preventing others from growing. So what you might do is limit each database to a certain size to where if they all reached their max, the hard drive still has just a little bit of space. Okay, so basically, you're sort of hedging your bet there. If one database grows out of control and fills the hard drive, and then other databases are unable to grow, you've potentially now affected not only the database that grew to fill the hard drive, but every other database on that hard drive is affected because they can no longer grow. If you limit each database, now they can each grow up to their max. So if one grows quote-unquote out of control, it'll hit its max, but it won't continue to grow and affect the other databases. They'll all have room to move up to their max. Okay, so that's auto grow. Now, you can also just disable it. You can clear this box, hit OK. Auto grow would be disabled, and then you kind of are on your own to monitor the usage of your data file and grow it before it fills up. Because if the data file fills up, everything happened in that database will start failing. You won't be able to save data to it. It'll be full. Okay, so you'll have to either grow it, delete some stuff. Same thing applies for your transaction log. It's basically exactly the same settings, percent versus megabytes, unlimited versus limited file. Again, be very careful. If the transaction log fills up, you basically can't do anything in your database because it needs to use the transaction log in order to do things in the database. And we'll review what the transaction log does here in the next lesson. So same settings there for auto growth. So that's sort of the basics of data files. Now let's real quickly talk about file groups. And there's lots of reasons why you would use them. Again, the scope of this lesson aimed at the accidental DBA is all about understanding what could be set up and how you could maybe split things up a little bit, not necessarily for performance tuning. There's a whole world of data on performance tuning and file groups and how to back up with file groups. So not going to get into quite that detail. Again, we're just kind of keeping it high level. So to set up file groups, when you're creating a file, you can actually create them here. If you saw when I dropped down, you could say new file group. Or you can come over to the file groups page. So I'm going to come over to the file groups page, and you can see that in my primary file group right now it thinks I have 2 files. You can make a file group, read only, and it can be default. Okay, so there's some options there. You can't ever make the primary read only. So I'm going to click add, and now I'm going to have a new file group. And I might call this file group indexes. And I might say, well, I'm not going to make it read only, but I'm not going to make it the default either. And I'm going to do that. So I've made a new file group called indexes. So if I go back over to my files, I could, instead of calling this data, make this the index file. It's still rows data because it still contains data, and I'm going to change its file group to indexes. Now, what does that do for me? By having 2 files in the same file group, you can't control what goes where, because data in your database will go to whatever file group you tell it. Primary versus indexes versus secondary, okay, whatever the case may be. But by creating another file group, now this file is in a different group from this file. So what that lets me do, and I'll just click OK. Actually, I'm going to make sure I've put this in the same place as my other files. So SQL data, R2, OK. And I'm not going to name it. By default, it'll basically give it this name with the correct extension. So I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to hit OK. It's executed. Now if we go look real quick, you'll see we have that new file. There it is, AdventureWorks index, and it's NDF, which is a secondary data file. You can see in the type description here, an NDF is a SQL database secondary data file. And for some reason, my MDFs are associated with Notepad. Otherwise, this would say SQL Server data file. Okay, so now I have those 2 files. So let's look at a table inside of my database. I'm going to right-click, hit Properties, and you can see on the Storage tab, this table is in the primary file group. Okay? When you're creating a table, you can put them in different file groups. So I could choose to place this table in that secondary file group, but that secondary file group was specifically for indexes. So let's take a look at the indexes. Take a look at this one here. So this is a unique index, apparently, on department name. Okay, and you have, again, the storage option, and you can put it in a different file group. So I could change this, and now essentially that one, just that data for that index is in this indexes file group. I hit OK, and it will recreate the index because it has to, so it drops, recreates the index. But now this index exists in the indexes file group, while this table still exists in the table file group. So what I've effectively done, and in this example, they're both on the same folder on the same hard drive. But if I would have created that indexes file on a separate hard drive, I've essentially now separated the read-write load for those 2 different files onto completely different hard drives. So that means that they're not in contention with one another for I/O resources because they're on 2 different drives. Okay, you can do that with indexes. You can do that with tables. You saw on the property of the table that you can put the table on different file groups. So if I wanted to create my really big, slow, heavy archive tables that get read a lot and put all those onto a separate file group and put them on a separate hard drive, I could. So the sky's kind of the limit, but in order to be able to sort of direct where things go, you create these file groups. And then each file group can have multiple files based on its data storage requirements, but you can't control where it goes in that file group. You can only control which file group it goes to. So that's file groups. Again, high level. Just wanted to give you the taste of them so that you know what they are if you encounter them in your database, and you have a little bit of control when it comes to splitting things up.